I fell into the habit of dropping in to see Isabel 3 or 4 times a week in the afternoon after my day's work was over. She was generally alone at that hour and glad to have a gossip. The persons to whom Elliot had introduced her were much older than she, and I discovered that she had a few friends of her own generation. Mine were for the most part busy till dinner time, and I found it more agreeable to talk with Isabel than to go to my club and play bridge with rather grouchy Frenchmen who did not particularly welcome the intrusion of a stranger. Her charming way of treating me as if she and I were of an age made conversation easy, and we joked and laughed and chaffed one another, chatting now about ourselves, now about our common acquaintances, now about books and pictures, so that the time passed very agreeably. One of the defects of my character is that I can never grow used to the plainness of people. However sweet a disposition a friend of mine may have, years of intimacy can never reconcile me to his bad teeth or lopsided nose. On the other hand, I never cease to delight in his comeliness, and after 20 years of familiarity, I am still able to take pleasure in a well-shaped brow or delicate line of a cheekbone. So I never came into Isabel's presence without feeling anew a little thrill of pleasure in the perfection of her oval face, in the creamy delicacy of her skin, and in the bright warmth of her hazel eyes. Then a very unexpected thing happened. In all big cities, there are self-contained groups that exist without intercommunication, small worlds within a greater world that lead their lives, their members dependent upon one another for companionship, as though they inhabited islands separated from each other by an unnavigable strait. Of no city, in my experience, is this more true than of Paris. There, high society seldom admits outsiders into its midst. The politicians live in their own corrupt circle. The bourgeois, great and small, frequent one another. Writers congregate with writers. It's remarkable in Andre Gilde's journal to see with how few people he seems to have been intimate who did not follow his own calling. Painters hobnob with painters, and musicians with musicians. The same thing is true of London, but in a less marked degree. There, birds of a feather flock much less together. There are a dozen houses where at the same table you may meet a duchess, an actress, a painter, a member of the parliament, a lawyer, and a dressmaker, and an author. The events of my life had led me at one time and another to dwell transitorily in pretty well all the worlds of Paris, even, through Eliot, in the closed world of the Boulevard Saint-Germain. But that which I liked best, better than the discreet circles that had its center in what is now called the Avenue Foch, better than the cosmopolitan crew that patronized La Rue and the Café de Paris, better than the noisy, sordid gaiety of Montmartre, and that section of which the artery is the Boulevard du Montparnasse. In my youth I spent a year in a tiny apartment near the Lion de Belfort, on the 5th floor, from which I had a spacious view of the cemetery. Montparnasse has still for me the tranquil air of a provincial town that was characteristic of it then. When I passed through the dingy, narrow Rue d'Odessa, I remember with a pang the shabby restaurant where we used to foregather to dine, painters and illustrators and sculptors, I but for Arnold Bennett on occasion, the only writer, and sit late discussing excitedly, absurdly, angrily, painting and literature. It is still a pleasure to me to stroll down the boulevard and look at the young people who are as young as I was then and invent stories for myself about them. When I have nothing better to do, I take a taxi and go and send the old Café du Dôme. It is no longer what it was then, the meeting place exclusively of Bohemia. The small tradesmen of a neighborhood have taken to visiting it, and strangers from the other side of the Seine come to it in hope of seeing a world that has ceased to exist. Students come to it still, of course, painters and writers, but most of them are foreigners, and when you sit there you hear around as much Russian, Spanish, German, and English as French. But I have a notion that they are saying very much the same sort of things as we said 40 years ago, only they speak of Picasso instead of Manet, and Andre Breton instead of Guillaume Apollinaire. My heart goes out to them. When I had been in Paris about a fortnight, I was sitting one evening at the Dôme, and since the terrace was crowded, I had been forced to take a table in the front row. It was fine and warm. The plane trees were just bursting into leaf, and there was in the air that sense of leisure, lightheartedness, and alacrity that was peculiar to Paris. I felt at peace with myself, but not lethargically, with exhilaration rather. Suddenly, a man walking past me stopped and, with a grin that displayed a set of very white teeth, said, "Hello." I looked at him blankly. He was tall and thin, he wore no hat, and he had a mop of dark brown hair that badly needed cutting. His upper lip and his chin were concealed by a thick brown beard. His forehead and his neck were deeply tanned. He wore a frayed shirt without a tie, brown threadbare coat, and a pair of shabby gray slacks. He looked a bum, and to the best of my belief I had never seen him before. I put him down for one of those good-for-nothings who have gone to the devil in Paris, and I expected him to pull a hard-luck story to whittle out a few francs out of me for dinner and a bed. He stood in front of me, his hands in his pockets, showing his white teeth, with a look of amusement in his dark eyes. "You don't remember me," he said. "I've never seen you before in my life." I was prepared to give him 20 francs, but I wasn't prepared to let him get away with the bluff that we knew one another. "Larry," he said. "Good God, sit down," he chuckled, stepped forward, and took the empty chair at my table. "Have a drink." I beckoned to the waiter. "How could you expect me to recognize you with all that hair on your face?" The waiter came and he ordered an orangeade. Now that I looked at him, I remembered the peculiarity of his eyes, which came from the black of his iris being as black as that of the pupil, and which gave them at once intensity and opaqueness. "How long have you been in Paris?" I asked. "A month." "Are you going to stay?" "For a while." While I asked these questions, my mind was busy. I noticed that the cuffs of his trousers were ragged and that there were holes in the elbows of his coat. He looked as destitute as any beachcomber I had ever met in an eastern port. It was hard in those days to forget the depression, and I wondered whether the crash of '29 had left him penniless. I didn't much like the thought of that, and not being a person to beat around the bush, I asked outright, "Are you down and out?" "No, I'm all right." "What makes you think that?" "Well, you look as if you could do with a square meal, and the things you've got on are only fit for the garbage can." "Are they as bad as that?" "I never thought about it. As a matter of fact, I've been meaning to get myself a few odds and ends, but I never seemed to get able to get down to it." I thought he was shy or proud and didn't see why I should put up with that sort of nonsense. "Don't be a fool, Larry. I'm not a millionaire, but I'm not poor. If you're short of cash, let me lend you a few thousand francs. That won't break me." He laughed outright. "Thanks a lot, but I'm not short of cash. I've got more money than I can spend." "Notwithstanding the crash?" "Oh, that didn't affect me. Everything I had was in government bonds. I don't know whether they went down in value. I never inquired, but I do know that Uncle Sam went on paying up the coupons like the decent old party he is. In point of fact, I've been spending so little during the last few years, I must have quite a bit in hand." Where have you come from now, then? India? Oh, I heard you had been there. Isabel told me she apparently knows the manager of your bank in Chicago. Isabel? When did you see her last? Yesterday. She's not in Paris. She is indeed. She's living in Elliot Templeton's apartment. That's grand. I'd love to see her. Though I was watching his eyes pretty closely while we were exchanging these remarks, I could discern only a natural surprise and pleasure, but no feeling more complicated. Gray's there too. You know they're married? Yes, Uncle Bob, Dr. Nelson, my guardian, wrote to me, but he died some years ago. It's occurred to me that with this break in what appeared his only link with Chicago and his friends there, he probably knew nothing of what had happened. I told him of the birth of Isabel's 2 daughters, of the death of Henry Matron and Louisa Bradley, of Gray's ruin, and of Elliot's generosity. Is Elliot here too? No. For the first time in 40 years, Elliot was not spending the spring in Paris, though looking younger than he was now, 70, and, as usual with men of that age, there were days when he felt tired and ill. Little by little he had given up taking any but walking exercise. He was nervous about his health, and his doctor came in to see him twice a week to thrust into an alternative buttock a hypodermic needle with the fashionable injection of the moment. At every meal, at home or abroad, he took from his pocket a little gold box from which he extracted a tablet which he swallowed with the reserved air of one performing a religious rite. His doctor had recommended him to take the cure at Montecanati, a watering place in the north of Italy, and after this he proposed to go to Venice to look for a font of a design suitable to his Romanesque church. He was less unwilling to leave Paris unvisited, since each year he found it socially more unsatisfactory. He did not like old people, and resented it when he was invited to meet only persons of his own age, and the young he found vapid. The adornment of the church he had built was now a main interest in his life, and here he could indulge his ineradicable passions for buying works of art with the comfortable assurance that he was doing it to the glory of God. He had found in Rome an early altar of honey-colored stone, and had been dickering in Florence for 6 months for a triptych to the Senese school to put over it. Then Larry asked me how Gray was liking Paris. I'm afraid he's feeling rather lost here. I tried to explain to him how Gray had struck me. He listened to me with his eyes fixed on my face in a meditative, unblinking gaze that suggested to me, I don't know why, that he was listening to me not with his ears but with some inner, more sensitive organ of hearing. It was queer and not very comfortable. But you'll see for yourself, I finished. Yes, I'd love to see them. I suppose I shall find the address in the phone book. But if you don't want to scare them out of their wits and drive the children to screaming hysterics, I think it'd be wise to have your hair cut and your beard shaved. He laughed. I've been thinking of it. There is no object in making myself conspicuous. And, while you're about it, you might get yourself a new outfit. I suppose I'm a bit shabby. When I came to leave India, I found that I had nothing but the clothes I stand up in. He looked at the suit I was wearing and asked me who my tailor was. I told him, but added that he was in London and so couldn't be of much use to him. We dropped the subject, and he began to talk again of Gray and Isabel. I've been seeing quite a lot of them, I said. They're very happy together. I've never had a chance of talking to Gray alone, and anyway, I dare say he wouldn't talk to me about Isabel, but I know he's devoted to her. His face is rather sullen in repose, and his eyes are harassed, but when he looks at Isabel, such a gentle, kind look comes into them. It's rather moving. I have a notion that All through their trouble, she stood by him like a rock, and he never forgets how much he owes her. You'll find Isabel changed. I didn't tell him she was beautiful as she had never been before. I wasn't sure he had the discernment to see how pretty, strapping girl had made herself into the wonderfully graceful, delicate, and exquisite woman. There are men who are affronted by the aids that art can supply to feminine nature. She's very good to Gray. She's taking infinite pains to restore his confidence in himself. But it was growing late, and I asked Larry if he would come along to the boulevard and dine with me. No, I don't think so. Thanks, he answered. I must be off. He got up, nodded in a friendly way, and stepped out onto the pavement.